Thank you, Chair. I beg to move that this House has considered Hertfordshire Greenbelt and the National Planning Policy Framework. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I especially welcome the opportunity to bring the threats to Hertfordshire's Greenbelt to the Minister's attention again. The importance of the Greenbelt in my own constituency of St Albans and across the county of Hertfordshire more broadly cannot be overstated. In fact, more than half of Hertfordshire is designated as being within the London Metropolitan Greenbelt. Nationally, we have a housing crisis and an ecological crisis. And when it comes to planning in the Greenbelt, the answer is sustainable housing that responds to housing need. But that is not what the government's planning system delivers. The government's planning system is developer-led, not community-led. And the government's planning system does not deliver the social homes that we need, and it does not protect our Greenbelt. Nationwide, almost 18,000 homes built on the Greenbelt, barely 10% were affordable. Mr Chair, in my constituency of St Albans District Council are being asked to build more than 14,600 homes over the next 15 years. They can build 5,000 of those on brownfield, so the remaining 9,000 will have to be built on Greenbelt. The neighbouring authority of Hertfordshire wants to build 6,000 homes right on our border, removing the Greenbelt altogether between two villages and creating a new monster-sized settlement. And the Conservative government still wants us to house a strategic rail freight interchange the size of 490 football pitches, which is also likely to attract thousands of lorries. Could this ever be described as sustainable development? No, it can't. At the heart of the problem is the government's national planning policy framework. The government has a standard methodology which produces top-down housing targets. Ministers have tried to tell me, in response to my many parliamentary questions on this matter, that their standard method for calculating housing does not produce targets per se. They say it is merely a starting point from which councils can start to work. I would be grateful if the Minister could confirm to me how many councils have successfully managed to submit a successful local plan with a housing target that has been revised down from the standard method. The very top of government tells us that the Greenbelt will be protected. At the recent Conservative Party conference, the Prime Minister himself promised that the homes that we need will be built on brownfield sites and, quote, not on green fields. Indeed, the Minister for Levelling Up Housing and Communities told the Honourable Member for Watford, who is present here today, at his recent debate last month, that the National Planning Policy Framework gives the necessary protections to Greenbelt land when local authorities come to draw up their local plans. But I'm afraid, Mr Chair, this is simply not the case. Let me give you an example. Roundhouse Farm, near Coney Heath, in my constituency. Now, I understand that given the quasi-judicial role of the Secretary of State, it is not appropriate for government ministers to comment on appeals under consideration, but this one has been concluded. St Albans District Council and Welwyn Hatfield District Council jointly refused permission for a development of 100 houses on the Hertfordshire Greenbelt at Roundhouse Farm near Coney Heath. Both councils, having regard to the National Planning Policy Framework, considered that it would be damaging to the Greenbelt to allow an inappropriate development such as this to proceed. The Minister's planning inspectors, however, disagreed, and yet another chunk of precious Greenbelt land was given over to development. The inspector gave more weight to the calculation of housing need under the government standard method than the protection of the Greenbelt. In setting out their reasons for overturning this decision, the planning inspector said, and I quote, "I am aware of the written ministerial statement of December 2015, which indicates that unmet need is unlikely to clearly outweigh harm to the Greenbelt and any other harm so as to establish very special circumstances. However," and this is the critical line, Mr Chair, "I note that this provision has not been incorporated within the National Planning Policy Framework, which has subsequently been updated, and similar guidance within the planning practice guidance has been removed." He then said, "I can therefore see no reason to give this anything other than little weight as a material consideration, little weight to the Greenbelt." The inspector's appeal decision went on to say, I afford very substantial weight to the provision of market housing, which would make a positive contribution to the supply of market housing in both local authority areas. So if the government genuinely believes that there are sufficient protections for Greenbelt in the National Planning Policy Framework, I would be grateful if the Minister could explain to me and my constituents how this decision came to be overturned by the Secretary of State on recommendation from the Planning Inspector. I would be grateful to know if the Minister accepts the conclusion of the Planning Inspector that the provision to protect the Greenbelt has not been incorporated within the National Planning Policy Framework and that similar protections within the planning practice guidance have been removed. And if the Minister does accept those findings from the Planning Inspector, I'd be grateful to hear whether the Government intends to rectify this. Following this shock decision, I asked the Secretary of State to intervene and urgently issue guidance on determining appeals to the Planning Inspector. This would mean that a greater weight would be attached to the objective of protecting Greenbelt than just to the standard housing need methodology calculation. When I asked this question, Mr Chair, I got this reply from the Government. The Government is firmly committed to protecting and enhancing Greenbelt land for future generations as set out in our manifesto. That is why, for decision-taking, local authorities should regard the construction of buildings in the Greenbelt as inappropriate and refuse planning permission unless there are exceptional circumstances as determined by the local authority. But local authorities, in this exact case, 2 of them, in fact, did precisely this, but they had their refusal overturned anyway. So I would be grateful to understand whether the Minister now accepts that in terms of protecting our precious Greenbelt land, that the National Planning Policy Framework simply isn't fit for purpose. It must be updated without further delay, and new guidance should be issued to the Planning Inspector. Now, this is just one example of local authorities doing everything within their power to protect our natural environment and having their decisions overturned by the very same government that professes to be its protector. I am sure there are countless others. Let me turn briefly to the standard method and the Greenbelt weighting. At some stage, every council in Hertfordshire will have to make a judgment call. Either they have to come up with a local plan that meets central targets, and they have to be the ones who wave goodbye to the Greenbelt, or they have to try and call the government's bluff, claim exceptional circumstances to protect the Greenbelt, and wait and see what the Planning Inspector says. But the problem is that the Planning Inspector may well take their powers away altogether. Council leaders are accepting that they would almost certainly leave communities in a weaker position than they are now. And any canny developer would immediately slap an application in for the sites that we most want to protect. So the situation is deeply unsatisfactory. So as we have discovered, the repeated claims by the government that the standard method calculation does not produce centrally imposed targets just does not stand up to scrutiny. In fact, the day-to-day interpretation by the Planning Inspector of the National Planning Policy Framework shows that this is exactly how these targets are being treated. So I will ask the Minister again, will he commit today to urgently issue guidance to the Planning Inspector that has principles for protecting the Greenbelt and to ensure that those principles are given more weighting when deciding appeals and examining local plans, and give it more weight than the arbitrary numbers that are being reached through the standard method calculation? I ask him to do so urgently, Mr Chair, as yet another Hertfordshire district has just put out their draft local plan for consultation. Hertsmere Borough Council proposes bulldozing over a substantial swathe of the Greenbelt land that sits between 2 villages in my constituency. Their shocking proposal, called Bowman's Cross, would see the effective conjoining of London Coney and Coney Heath. The plan would mean 6,000 houses, 4 slap bang in the middle of fields and natural habitats that currently surround and separate the 2 communities. The impact of this monster development won't be felt by the residents in Hertsmere. They'll be felt by my constituents in St Albans. Nonetheless, I cannot help but have some sympathy for yet another Conservative-led council that has felt the pressure from their Conservative government to meet these huge top-down housing targets. In conclusion, Mr Chair, I am more than aware of the critical shortage of housing supply in the country. Liberal Democrats are absolutely committed to providing the truly affordable new homes that are so desperately needed. And in St Albans, for example, I am proud that the Liberal Democrat-run District Council is driving ahead to build the social homes that we need. But across Hertfordshire, Liberal Democrat-run and Conservative-run councils alike are all in the same position. Conservative-led Broxbourne has given up 15% of its district's total Greenbelt land. That's more Greenbelt land sacrificed than any other council in England. Research by the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England recently found that in the addition to the 17,500 homes that have already been approved or are being built on Hertfordshire's Greenbelt, more than 50,000 extra have been proposed. So, Mr Chair, to be clear, I am not asking for the government to stop building. I'm asking for the government to strike the right balance and to create a planning framework that delivers sustainable development. It's in the government's gift to do that by updating the National Planning Policy Framework and the guidance as I've described, and I hope that the government will take this up without any further delay. Thank you.